Great. Okay. Great. Thank you. Thanks, Joe, and thank you to Fair Housing for Frome for hosting this event. So my name's Sonia. I'm from the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and our charity is based in Bristol, and we aim to tackle the twin challenges of climate change and fuel poverty through the work that we do. I'm here today to talk to you about the MEAS regulations. So MEAS regulations for the domestic private rented sector. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go through the MEAS regulations and what they are, understanding and interpreting EPCs, making a property EPC or above, funding options that are available, and then we're going to have a section on MEAS exemptions and a Q&A session at the end. So I think in the chat, there's sort of, yeah, I think it was clarified. You at the end, you can sort of post questions. So if you save your questions to the end, and then yeah, stick around and I can answer them. Or if I can't answer them, I'll get back to you. Okay, so MEAS regulations, what are they? The MEAS regulations set a minimum energy efficiency level for domestic private rented properties, and it applies to properties that are let on specific types of tenancy agreements and are legally required to have an EPC. So the tenancy agreements include the assured and short hold tenancies and regulated and domestic agricultural tenancies. So I think the short hold assured tenancies are the ones that most people have. And then if a property is legally required to have an EPC, it will be legally required to have one if it has been sold, let or modified in the past 10 years. So what you have to do is get an EPC if you don't currently have one, if this applies to you. And if your EPC has a rating of F or G, you need to take action to improve it to an EPC rating E. And I've just got in brackets there, this is likely to change to EPC band C by late 2025. There's currently a consultation going on at the moment about raising the EPC level, and it will almost certainly be raised higher. It could be a D, but there has been talk of it being raised to a C. So to make a property compliant, you must install relevant energy efficiency measures. And relevant energy efficiency measures are a measure or package of measures recommended in your EPC report that can be installed for £3,500 or less, including VAT. So that £3,500 is known as the cost cap. And I will sort of refer back to this relevant energy efficiency improvements sort of throughout the slideshow. Okay. So MEAS regulations, the benefits to tenants are increased comfort, lower heating bills, and both of those things lead to less worry and stress. And then the benefits to the landlords are that properties become more desirable and easier to let. The market value of the property increases, and there are reduced long-term sort of maintenance costs for the property as well. So what is an EPC? So an EPC gives your property a current energy efficiency rating, taking into account the building fabric, heating system, windows, the size, and the building type. So it's an assessor comes out, takes the measurements, takes note of all the things related to the property, or the building itself, and then goes away and gives your property an EPC rating. So it gives it a grade between A and G, as well as a number between 1 to 100. Higher grades and numbers signify that the home is more efficient and the fuel bills will be less. Lower ones sort of indicate the opposite. It also gives you a potential rating and lists various measures that you can install to bring it up to that potential rating. the measures are listed in order of what's the most relevant. So the EPC decides that by taking into account the cost of the measure and the energy saving associated with it. So quite often on EPCs, you do see loft insulation and wall insulation recommended quite high up in the report, sort of recommendation 1 or 2, because the energy savings are quite high with those. You don't often see recommendations for upgrading windows, either on an EPC report, or if it is on an EPC report, it's normally quite low down. And that's because the cost of installing them is quite high in comparison to the energy saving that they provide. So that's like why the measures are listed in the order that they are on the EPC. We can have a look at an example EPC in a second. And last thing is they will expire. So the EPC does expire after 10 years. So it does require you to get a new one if you are obliged to have one. So if the property has sort of been let on a new tenancy in the 10 years. So about EPCs, if you have an old EPC, it would be worth getting a new one. Older ones are less accurate. New ones, if you have had work done since having the old EPC done, then the new one will take into account any recent energy efficiency improvements. And the new ones will also include more relevant recommendations. There is often like relatively few recommendations on older EPCs. And another thing is that why it's worth getting a new one, if you have a solid wall property, is that I think in 2017, they changed the U values associated with solid walls. So the sort of value that they assign gets a few points more on an EPC. So it's unlikely to take a property from an F to an E rating, but you would get a few more points if you've got an old EPC that was done before 2017. Even if you haven't changed anything else, you should get a slightly higher rating. So making a property EPC or above, look at the relevant energy efficiency measures on the EPC. As I say, we'll look at one in a second. They're not listed in the order in which you should do things. And what you do is go through the list and install the measures that are within the price cap, so that's £3,500. So this is an EPC, so it is actually a real EPC. I just took some screenshots from it. So it's got a current rating of 20, a G rating just outside of an F, and it's got a potential rating of a C. So this is a breakdown of the energy performance, and you can see that it was rated very, very poor for walls, very poor for windows, even though, as I mentioned, their windows are unlikely to be recommended on the EPC report as an improvement. And it got a poor rating for the boiler as well, and very poor rating for the hot water. So these are the recommendations on that EPC. So as you can see, the loft insulation is the first one. So we know that EPC had a rating of 20, and you can see that by installing loft insulation, it brings it up by 2 points. So I know it's not a huge saving, but relative to the cost, that's quite good, which is why loft insulation is recommended. And also loft insulation and cavity wall insulation are generally sort of quite easy wins for a property in terms of energy saving. Particularly if it's sort of standard loft where insulation can just be laid on the floor of the loft. It gets sort of harder and more expensive to insulate properties that don't have cavity walls and don't have standard lofts. So it's sort of, you can get those insulated, but they're just known as sort of the easy wins. So that's the first recommendation. You can see recommendation 2 and 3 are above the cost cap. So the landlord for this property wouldn't need to install them. But the next 3 recommendations are within the cost cap. So you've got hot water cylinder insulation, draft proofing, and replacing a boiler with a new condensing boiler. So if you look at the sort of score that each one is given, you basically, the way that it's presented here is that if you did the recommendations in the order that it's recommending on the EPC, but the landlord wouldn't need to do that because these 2 are outside of the cost cap. So the you take sort of, you can see from the loft insulation that it gets 22 points, and then from installing draft proofing, that goes from 48 to 51. So that's another 3 points. And then by installing a new condensing boiler, or replacing the old boiler with a new condensing boiler, that gets 13 points. So the initial score was 20, so you get 2 for that, 3 for that, and then 13 for that. So that would take you up to a score of 38. And if we just go back, so that would take this property to a score of 38. So it'd still be an F rating, but it'd be demonstrated that the landlord had installed all the measures, or the relevant energy efficiency measures within the cost cap. And so in this case, the landlord would apply for an exemption as well after doing this work. But you know, with lots of properties, by installing the recommended measures that are within the cost cap, it should hopefully bring the property up to an EPC E rating or above. So that's just summarising what I just said. Install the relevant energy efficiency measures, get the new EPC afterwards, and then if the property is still substandard, you would apply for a relevant exemption. And just worth pointing out as well, with EPCs, the impact of the measure will vary depending on the property. The size, age, heating method, wall type, floor and roof type of house will all impact on how relevant each measure is, and the score that it will get as well. So it's not the same for each property. And the recommendations on an EPC are the best indicator of how each measure will improve the property. So the shortcomings of EPCs, EPCs favour the cheaper heating method. So the EPC score is based on the heating costs. And I know there's at the moment, with the energy price hikes, well, energy prices, the price cap going up in April, it's, you know, there's a whole separate conversation to be had around that, and EPCs do need to catch up with that as well. But just sort of as a general rule with EPCs, it's calculated based on the costs of the heating rather than the, I guess, like the carbon emissions that are associated with the different heating. So gas currently scores higher on an EPC, mains gas boiler scores higher on an EPC than an air source heat pump. There needs to probably be a lot of work done behind the scenes to address this. It'll be no easy task as well, but that's one of the shortcomings. They're not really set up to sort of assist in our path towards net zero. And another thing that's worth pointing out is that the recommendations are based on the existing heating method. So a gas central heating system won't be recommended on an EPC if it already has electric heating. It would just recommend a more efficient electric heater. So if it has room heaters, for example, it would recommend sort of high performance storage heaters, or heat retention storage high heat retention storage heaters, that's the term, rather than a gas boiler. So that's just worth knowing as well. Okay, so now I'm going to come on to the options for funding to improve the property. So there's third-party funding where the cost cap doesn't apply. So if you are eligible for any funding for your property, definitely recommend taking advantage of that, because we don't know how long it's going to be around for. I guess particularly for landlords, some of the new sort of LADS funding streams are like owner occupied only. So if there's funding available, I recommend taking advantage of it. You can also use a combination of third-party funding and self-funding. So if the third-party funding is less than £3,500, and not enough to improve your property to an EPC, you can top up, or you would need to top up with your own funds. And then if it's completely self-funded and so you're not entitled to any help with funding, you have to fund it all yourself, and you cannot pay the upfront cost, there is the option of a Lendology loan. I think there's a specific landlord option for Lendology loans to cover the cost. And I've just put in there Green Deal Finance could be an option. Green Deal Finance is a thing of the sort of recent past, sort of maybe around 2013-14. It never really took off, but the idea behind it might be more relevant to now with energy prices going up. But basically, it was where you took out a loan to have energy efficiency work done on your property, and that energy efficiency, those energy efficiency measures would lower your energy bills, and you'd pay back the loan through the difference in your energy bills. So you'd still be paying the same amount in your energy bills as what you were before you had the energy efficiency measure done. But once it was installed, a proportion of that would be going towards paying the loan back, which, yeah, that might not be a bad option now. I think it's still around. It's just, we hear so little about it and so few people use it that you'd have to look into that if you wanted to explore that further. So the types of third-party funding that are available, so there's the energy company obligation, which is a government initiative. It puts an obligation on energy suppliers who have sort of a customer base of over a certain amount. So over a certain amount of customers, basically the bigger players, they are obliged to take part in a scheme to help reduce carbon emissions and tackle fuel poverty through funding for energy efficiency measures. And then the LAD scheme aims to raise the energy efficiency of low income and low EPC rated homes. There's the MENDIP DC EPC improvement grants. So you apply for that through MENDIP, and it's for measures that are recommended on an EPC. In order to qualify, the tenant does have to meet sort of the specific vulnerability criteria, and the EPC has to be rated sort of D or below. And then there's Frome's Big Idea, which is a solar PV project. And then there's Avalon Community Energy. Now, that's not, I don't think that applies to Frome, but it does apply to Glastonbury, Shepton Mallet, and some other places, which is why I left it on, just in case there were landlords who own property in some of their areas. And there's funding, again, it's sort of the tenant occupant needs to meet certain vulnerability criteria. It's for smaller scale measures like draft proofing. But they are the options, but these two are the main ones. And these are the types of measures that you can get funding towards. So loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, as I mentioned earlier, they're the sort of easy wins, cost effective, so definitely worth doing those if you haven't already. Party wall insulation is where you have a cavity with the wall that you share with your neighbour. So that's become a thing sort of, yeah, in the last few years to insulate there. There are savings to be made with that. I know it's not an external wall, but there's funding there for that as well. And if nothing else, it would probably improve the soundproofing. So there's that available. Boiler upgrades for mains gas and LPG. There's funding for first times mains gas and smart heating controls. Oh, sorry, there's a spelling, a misspelling there, typo there, but that's internal and external wall insulation, or external and internal wall insulation. There hasn't been any funding around for that for a while, so that's sort of good news. Flat roof insulation, solar PV, sorry, I've just noticed another typo here as well, where that should have its own bullet point, but underfloor insulation, high heat retention night storage heaters, and air source heat pumps and controls. A lot of these measures will be partially funded only, and for ECO and LADS funding, it is it is based on the circumstances of the occupant/tenant, so they would need to fulfill certain vulnerability criteria in order to qualify. So now get on to exemptions. So the MEAS regulations does recognise that not all properties can easily reach an EPC, and there are various exemptions in place that landlords can apply for. I don't know if it's worth mentioning something about listed buildings now, but listed buildings aren't necessarily exempt from the MEAS regulations. They do have to comply with MEAS regulations unless the measures that are recommended would unacceptably alter the look and the character of a building. So lots of listed buildings will have recommendations that don't, like low energy lighting or loft insulation or boiler upgrades. So they're not exempt, and I'll get onto it in a second, but there is an exemption that's there for if certain measures, if a landlord cannot get consent for certain measures, then they would apply for a specific exemption, but I'll talk about that when I get to it. The first one is that I'm going to talk about is all improvements made exemption. So that's where all the relevant energy efficiency improvements have been made, but the property remains substandard. So going back to the example that I showed you with the property that was F rated, and if it installed the relevant energy efficiency measures, which were loft insulation, draft proofing, and upgrading the boiler to a condensing boiler, it came up at 38, I think it was, and it needed to be 39 to meet the EPC E rating. So that property would apply for an all improvements made exemption because they've done everything that's relevant, but the property still remains at an F rating. The next exemption on here is the high cost exemption. So that's when the cost of making even the cheapest recommended improvement would exceed the 3,500 cost cap. So that would be, like external wall insulation. A lot of the renewable measures that are recommended on EPCs are above the £3,500 as well. So that's for even the cheapest measure is more than 3,500. Then there's the wall insulation exemption. So it does include cavity walls, cavity wall insulation, internal wall insulation, and external wall insulation. And this is where expert advice has concluded that the measure is not appropriate for the property due to its potential negative impact on the fabric or structure of the property or the building that it forms part of. So specific wall exemption there for when though the wall insulation isn't suitable. And then the consent exemption. So this links to the listed buildings topic that I mentioned earlier. that sometimes you may, for a listed building, you may need planning permission to install something and that's been refused. So in that situation, the landlord of the listed building would apply for a consent exemption. It does actually also apply when a landlord cannot gain access to a property or the tenant's refused. So I have come across situations where there are elderly tenants living in the property and they don't want the hassle or the disruption of a new heating system being installed or a new boiler being installed. So in those situations, the landlord would apply for a consent exemption. Then there's the devaluation exemption. So again, expert advice has concluded that the installation of a specific energy efficiency measure would reduce the market value of the property by more than 5%. And then there's the new landlord exemption. This is, I've had a look at this and it is quite complicated because it's not solely referring to new landlords, just any new landlords. It's often sort of specific scenarios where leases have been overtaken by guarantors of tenants who've gone into liquidation. So it's, yeah, best to seek legal advice on this one if you're thinking of applying for it. It's kind of for if you became a landlord sort of by accident, I guess. So if you need to register an exemption, you go onto the MEAS website and register here. You need to upload the evidence as you go. So definitely your EPC, surveyor's reports for if you've got written advice that's concluded that things aren't relevant for the property. Evidence of consent where it was needed and refused. Quotes for the work if you're looking at high cost exemptions, or sometimes there might be a measure on your EPC that's below the 3,500 cost cap, but you might get a quote and it's over that, so you'd need to supply that in the evidence when you register that for that exemption. You can't, if you've got different measures that are different relevant energy efficiency measures on your EPC, you need to install the ones that you can and then register for the rest. So you can't just register for one of them and think that that covers all of the relevant energy efficiency improvements. It only covers the one that you're registering for. So you either need to improve them or register for them as well. And exemptions do not pass to a new owner if the property is sold. That owner would need to either install the measures or apply for a new exemption. So they last for 5 years, except the consent exemption, which if it's based on the tenant of the property refusing access, it lasts for the length of that tenancy if that's less than 5 years. And the new landlord exemption lasts for 6 months. So there is a bit more work going on around enforcement of MEAS regulations now. So I think it came in 2018, and there's just in the last sort of year or so, there's just been more work around enforcement. Local authorities are responsible for compliance and enforcement of MEAS regs, and they can issue compliance notices and penalty notices. And that's just, just MEAS have established a toolkit, a best practice guides for compliance and enforcement of MEAS. They're currently trialling this with different local authorities, and it's likely at some point it'll be rolled out to all local authorities as well. So I guess that enforcement work will only sort of continue. And then that's just a quick sort of table that shows you the different fines that you can get for the different breaches of the MEAS regs, but it is capped at £5,000 per property per breach. And then, yeah, that leads us to the end of the presentation. So I can can take questions now. But if you or your tenant want to contact us for further advice on keeping warm, saving energy, if you wanted to inquire about those funding options, then you can call this number or email this email address. And that's our website, csc.org.uk.
Thank you very much, Sonia. May I just add that if you want to ask questions, please pop them into the chat. Unless you would like to speak, then let me know in the chat and I'll be able to add you as a panelist and you'll be able to speak. Okay. Gretel, I've just add you as panelist. You should be able to speak. You might need to unmute yourself. No, it didn't quite work. Would you mind please popping a question in the chat? Here we go. You should be able to speak now, Gretel. If you unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, right. The message I put there earlier was at the beginning of the talk, and I wasn't too sure if there was going to be an audio for us so that we could speak. So that's fine. I'm not actually a landlord at the moment, and I am looking possibly to be a landlord in Bristol. So obviously this seminar is probably based for people who are in Frome or Somerset. But I imagine some of the regulations are much the same wherever you are.
Yeah, I guess the only difference would be the funding that's available may be slightly different in Bristol than Somerset, but everything else is the same.
Okay. And sorry, I've just left my notes next door. Hold on a second.
Yeah, that's fine.
So the funding, which you mentioned, which was like the lads and the energy company obligation.
Yeah.
Is that sort of like for any county, or is that just specific to Somerset and Frome?
So the energy company obligation is sort of available across the country. There's the help to heat sort of side strand of eco, which is standardized across the country as well. So that's where a client is either low income or in receipt of a disability benefit. That's like a sort of loose definition of them. But if you wanted to contact the advice line to find out specifically, then they'd be able to go through that with you. But that's one strand of it. So that's the help to heat strand. And then the other one is the EcoFlex strand. So that's where the local authorities set the criteria for funding sort of based on the demographics of their county. I think there's a standard sort of eligibility criteria across Somerset, but it's basically designed so that local authorities can design the criteria to sort of better serve their communities, because they know the demographics and can sort of set the criteria so they can help those most in need. So but yeah, the help to heat is sort of nationwide, and then the lads funding, they are more local schemes. There is one for Somerset County as a whole. There is another one for Bristol, and the criteria will be similar, but probably not exactly the same.
Yeah.
And the things that are on offer won't be exactly the same as well.
Okay, all right, that's useful. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gretel. Anybody else has any questions for Sonia? Just wanted to say this webinar was recorded and will be posted on the Frome Town Council's Healthy Homes project website. So if you'd like to look back at any of the information, or if you know any other landlords or anyone that would benefit from the information that was presented by Sonia, you'll be able to go back to it. And if there are any other questions, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sonia, on behalf of Frome Town Council.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for hosting. That's great. Thank you. And thanks for everyone that came.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.